The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. Mom, honestly, you're going to embarrass me. You're 58 years old. Maybe it's time you started acting like it instead of pretending you're still in your 20s. Marcus's voice carried across the crowded campus quad where families were gathering for the University of Colorado Denver's MBA graduation ceremony. The morning sun cast long shadows between the students and their loved ones, but nothing felt darker than the shadow my own. Sun had just cast over what should have been one of the proudest days of my life. I stood there in my carefully chosen outfit, a navy blue dress that complemented my still athletic figure, paired with comfortable heels that wouldn't slow me down if I needed to navigate the campus crowds. My silver hair was styled in a sleek bob that took me an hour to perfect that morning, and my makeup was flawless despite the early wake-up call. At 58, I maintained the same discipline with my appearance that I did with everything else in my life. But apparently, according to my son, I was trying too hard. Before we jump back into this story, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started with such promise. I'd driven the 45 minutes from my Capitol Hill apartment to the university campus, my heart swelling with pride as I navigated the parking lots filled with other families celebrating their graduates. 24 years ago, when Marcus was born, I never imagined I'd be sitting alone in my car, taking deep breaths to calm my nerves before his graduation. Back then, I thought David and I would be here together, beaming with shared pride at our son's accomplishments. But life rarely unfolds the way we imagine it will. David had left when Marcus was 15, not for another woman initially, but for what he called finding himself. What he found, apparently, was a series of young girlfriends and eventually Jessica Chen, a successful real estate developer who was everything I wasn't: wealthy, connected, and most importantly, 15 years younger than me. When Marcus turned 19 and started spending more time with his father and Jessica, I told myself it was natural. Young men need their fathers, I reasoned. I couldn't have predicted that 5 years later, I'd feel like a stranger at my own son's graduation. Walking across the campus that morning, I couldn't help but notice how other families moved together in tight units. Mothers linked arms with daughters, fathers clapped sons on the back, grandparents shuffled along with walkers and wheelchairs, proudly wearing their graduates' university colors. I walked alone, scanning the crowd for Marcus's familiar face, feeling simultaneously overdressed and underdressed, too young and too old, visible and invisible all at once. I'd been a personal trainer at Mountain View Fitness Center for the past 12 years, ever since my divorce was finalized and I needed to completely rebuild my life. The job had been a godsend. It allowed me to channel my lifelong love of athletics into a career that kept me physically and mentally strong during the darkest period of my life. My clients ranged from college athletes preparing for competitions to executives trying to maintain their health despite demanding schedules. Many of them were Marcus's age or younger, and they often commented on my energy and strength. "Linda, you're in better shape than I am, and I'm half your age," was something I heard regularly. But my son saw my career differently. Over the past few years, his comments had become increasingly pointed. "Mom, don't you think it's weird that you're training people who could be your kids?" he'd asked during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. "Maybe it's time to consider something more age-appropriate." When I'd suggested he visit the fitness center to see what I did, he'd declined with barely concealed embarrassment. "I don't think that's really my scene," he'd said, though he'd never actually seen my scene to judge it. The fitness center had become more than just my workplace. It was my sanctuary. The familiar rhythm of weights clinking, treadmills humming, and music pumping through the speakers created a soundtrack for the life I'd built from scratch. My regular clients had become like family, celebrating my victories and supporting me through challenges. When I'd mentioned Marcus's graduation, they'd all been excited for me. "You must be so proud," Sarah, one of my favorite clients, had said. "He's lucky to have such an inspiring mom." Inspiring. That was a word I'd heard often in recent years, but never from Marcus. As I finally spotted him near the registration, tables, my heart did what it always did when I saw my son. It swelled with unconditional love and pride. He looked handsome in his graduation cap and gown, the black fabric contrasting nicely with his dark hair and olive complexion that he'd inherited from his father. He was tall and lean, with the kind of natural confidence that had always made him stand out in a crowd. Watching him shake hands with what appeared to be university officials, I felt the familiar surge of maternal pride that had carried me through every soccer game, school play, and academic achievement of his childhood. But as I approached, I noticed he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a woman I recognized from social media photos, Jessica Chen. Even at 53, she looked effortlessly elegant in a way that spoke of expensive personal shoppers and regular spa treatments. Her black hair was pulled back in a sophisticated chignon, and her cream-colored designer dress probably cost more than I made in a month. Next to her stood Robert, her husband of 3 years, and Marcus's stepfather, a distinguished-looking man in his early 60s who owned a chain of successful restaurants throughout Colorado. What struck me most wasn't Jessica's polished appearance. It was the way Marcus interacted with her. He was animated, laughing at something she'd said, completely at ease in a way I hadn't seen him in years. When he spotted me approaching, that ease visibly shifted. His smile became forced, his posture more rigid. It was as if my presence reminded him of something he'd rather forget. "Hi, Mom," he said, leaning in for a brief, obligatory hug. "You made it." The phrase stung more than he probably intended. "You made it." As if my attendance at his graduation was somehow in question, as if I were an afterthought rather than the woman who'd sacrificed everything to ensure he had the opportunities that led to this day. I'd worked double shifts at the gym during his college years, training clients at 5 in the morning and 9 at night to help pay for his expenses that his father's sporadic support and modest scholarship didn't cover. I'd driven hours to attend his college events, even when it meant losing income from missed training sessions. Of course I'd made it. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I replied, trying to keep my voice light. "Congratulations, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." Jessica smiled warmly and extended her hand. "Linda, it's so nice to finally meet you in person. Marcus has told us so much about you." Her voice carried a slight accent that hinted at her Korean heritage, and her manner was gracious without being condescending. Despite everything, I found myself wanting to like her. "It's nice to meet you too," I replied, shaking her hand. "Thank you for everything you've done for Marcus." Robert nodded approvingly. "Your son is remarkable. His thesis on sustainable business practices was one of the most impressive projects I've ever read. You should be very proud." I was proud, but I was also confused. Marcus had never mentioned his thesis topic to me. During our phone calls, he'd been vague about his studies, changing the subject whenever I asked for details. Yet here was his stepfather, speaking knowledgeably about work I'd never heard about. "The ceremony starts in 30 minutes, Marcus said, checking his watch. "Mom, you should probably find your seat. The families section gets pretty crowded." The dismissal was gentle but unmistakable. I glanced around and noticed other families lingering together, taking photos, sharing excited conversation. But Marcus was already guiding Jessica and Robert toward what appeared to be a reserved seating area near the front of the outdoor amphitheater. "Where should I sit?" I asked, realizing I hadn't received any specific instructions about seating arrangements. Marcus paused, looking uncomfortable. "There should be general seating toward the back." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm sure you'll find a good spot. Toward the back, general seating, while his step-family was escorted to what were clearly premium seats. The hierarchy was becoming painfully clear. As I made my way to the general seating area, I couldn't help but replay every interaction that had led to this moment. When had I become the afterthought in my son's life? When had my role shifted from essential to peripheral? I thought about all the early morning training sessions I'd scheduled around his high school soccer games, the weekend tournaments I'd attended despite being exhausted from my work week. I remembered the night he'd called me from college, homesick and overwhelmed, and I'd driven 4 hours just to take him to dinner and remind him he could handle anything. But those memories felt increasingly distant as I watched him from my seat in the back rows, surrounded by families I didn't know, holding a program that listed his name but somehow made me feel like a stranger to his life. The ceremony itself was beautiful. The University of Colorado Denver had transformed their outdoor amphitheater into an elegant graduation venue, with flowers lining the stage and banners celebrating the class of 2024. The dean's speech was inspiring, full of hope about the future and the potential of the graduating class. When Marcus's name was called and he walked across the stage to receive his MBA, I felt the familiar surge of maternal pride, the same feeling I'd experienced at every milestone of his life. But something was different this time. As I watched him shake hands with the dean and pose for the official photograph, I realized I was experiencing this moment alone in a way I'd never been alone before. I was proud, yes, but I was also isolated. The other families around me were cheering for their graduates, taking pictures, sharing the moment. I was simply observing, like a spectator rather than a participant in my son's achievement. After the ceremony ended, families began gathering on the campus quad for informal celebrations and photo sessions. I made my way through the crowd, hoping to congratulate Marcus and perhaps take a few pictures together. When I found him, he was surrounded by a group that had clearly expanded beyond just Jessica and Robert. There were other couples I didn't recognize, all well-dressed and clearly comfortable with each other. They were laughing and taking group photos, and Marcus looked completely at home among them. "Mom," he said when he noticed me approaching, "these are some family friends of Jessica and Robert's. Everyone, this is my mother, Linda." The introductions were polite but brief. I smiled and shook hands, but it was clear I was interrupting a private celebration. After a few minutes of small talk, one of the women in the group suggested they move to a nearby restaurant for lunch. "We have reservations at that new place downtown," she said, "the one with the rooftop terrace." Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "That sounds perfect." Then, as if remembering I was there, he turned to me. "Mom, you're welcome to join us if you want, but I know you probably need to get back for work or whatever." Work or whatever? As if my career, my life, my schedule were all just minor inconveniences that I could easily rearrange. The casual dismissal stung more than an outright rejection would have. At least rejection would have acknowledged that my presence mattered enough to refuse. "Actually," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice, "I do have plans this afternoon." It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. I did have a life outside of Marcus's graduation, even if I'd been willing to rearrange it completely for this day. Marcus looked relieved. "Great. Then we'll talk soon. Thanks for coming, Mom. It means a lot." But as I watched him walk away, with his chosen family, I couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't actually mean much at all. I was the woman who'd given birth to him, raised him, sacrificed for him, and supported him through every challenge of his life. But today, I was also the woman who was too old to fit into the image he wanted to project. Standing alone in the campus quad as families continued their celebrations around me, I made a decision that would change everything. If Marcus thought I was too old to be part of his success story, I would show him exactly how wrong he was. But first, I needed to understand how we'd gotten to this point, and more importantly, who had helped convince my son that his mother was something to be ashamed of. The drive back to Denver gave me time to think, and what I thought about was a conversation I'd had with Marcus 6 months earlier. He'd called me on a Sunday evening, which was unusual since he typically communicated through brief text messages. "Mom," he'd said, "I've been talking to someone about our relationship, and I think we need to make some changes." Someone. At the time, I'd assumed he meant Jessica or Robert, or perhaps one of his friends. I'd been supportive, telling him I was glad he felt comfortable seeking advice about family relationships. "What kind of changes?" I'd asked. "Well, for starters, I think we need better boundaries. I'm an adult now, and I need to establish my independence. And honestly, some of your behavior makes it harder for me to be taken seriously." My behavior. I'd asked for examples, and he'd mentioned things that seemed insignificant at the time. The way I dressed when I met his friends, the enthusiasm I showed for my work, the fact that I still maintained an active social media presence. "It's just not very mature," he'd said. "People my age expect their parents to act more, parental." I'd been hurt but willing to listen. If my son felt I was somehow hindering his professional development or social acceptance, I wanted to understand how to fix it. Over the following months, I'd toned down my social media posts, dressed more conservatively when we met, and tried to ask fewer questions about his life. But instead of improving our relationship, the changes seemed to create more distance between us. Now, driving through downtown Denver as the afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings, I wondered if someone had been more than just a casual advisor. The way Marcus had spoken, the specific language he'd used about boundaries and maturity, suggested he'd been receiving professional guidance. And if that was the case, I wanted to know who was helping my son see me as a problem to be managed rather than a mother to be celebrated. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I called David. We hadn't spoken directly in over 2 years, communicating only through Marcus when necessary. But I needed to understand what was happening to our son, and David was the only other person who might have insights. "Linda?" His voice carried surprise when he answered the phone. "Is everything okay? Is Marcus all right?" "Marcus is fine," I said, settling into my favorite chair with a cup of tea. "He graduated today, actually. MBA from CU Denver." "I know. Jessica and Robert were there." His tone was cautious, as if he wasn't sure where this conversation was heading. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Has Marcus been seeing a counselor or therapist? Someone who's been giving him advice about our relationship?" There was a long pause. "Why are you asking?" "Because 6 months ago, our son called me with very specific ideas about boundaries and appropriate behavior that didn't sound like they came from him. And today, at his graduation, I felt like a stranger. Like I didn't belong in his life anymore." Another pause. "Linda, this is complicated." "Then uncomplicate it for me." David sighed deeply. "There's a family counselor that Jessica found, Dr. Patricia Webb. She specializes in blended families and helping adult children navigate complex family dynamics. Marcus has been seeing her for about a year." A year? Marcus had been receiving professional advice about managing me for an entire year, and no one had thought to mention it. What kind of advice is she giving him? I don't know all the details, but the general idea is helping Marcus establish healthy independence from patterns that might be holding him back. Patterns that might be holding him back. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "David, what patterns? What exactly have you and Jessica been telling this counselor about me?" "It's not like that, Linda. It's just that Marcus was having trouble with boundaries. And Dr. Webb helped him understand that sometimes family relationships can be, how did she put it, emotionally enmeshed in ways that prevent healthy development." Emotionally enmeshed. The clinical language was telling. Someone had pathologized my relationship with my son, turning normal maternal love and involvement into something unhealthy that needed professional intervention. "Has this Dr. Webb ever met me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Well, no, but she's worked with Marcus extensively, and she's very experienced with these types of situations. As if loving my son too much was a recognized psychological disorder requiring treatment. After I hung up with David, I sat in my apartment staring out at the city lights and thinking about patterns. There was definitely a pattern here, but it wasn't the one Dr. Patricia Webb had apparently identified. The pattern was that everyone, in Marcus's new life, his father, his stepmother, his stepfather, and now his therapist, had a vested interest in minimizing my role in his life. Whether intentionally or not, they'd created a narrative where I was the problem, the obstacle, the relationship that needed to be managed and contained. But I'd spent 12 years building a career that proved I was capable of far more than anyone expected from a 58-year-old divorced woman. My clients trusted me with their health, their goals, their confidence. Corporate executives paid premium rates for my training because I delivered results that other trainers couldn't. I deadlifted 250 pounds just last week, completed a half marathon in under 2 hours, and maintained a level of physical fitness that impressed people half my age. If Dr. Patricia Webb thought she could convince my son that I was too old to be relevant in his life, she was about to discover just how young I really was. And more importantly, she was about to learn that this mother wasn't going to disappear quietly into the background of her son's success story. Tomorrow, I would begin showing Marcus exactly who his mother really was. But tonight, I would start preparing for a confrontation that would change everything. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp Colorado sunshine that usually energized me for the day ahead. But as I prepared for my early training sessions at Mountain View Fitness Center, my mind was still processing everything that had happened at Marcus's graduation. I'd barely slept, replaying conversations and analyzing moments, trying to understand when exactly I'd become persona non grata in my own son's life. My first client of the day was Amanda Sterling, a 35-year-old marketing executive who'd been training with me for 3 years. She arrived at 6 sharp, as always, dressed in expensive workout gear and carrying the kind of determination that had made her one of the youngest VPs at her firm. Amanda was exactly the type of client who reminded me why I loved my job: driven, focused, and absolutely committed to pushing her limits. "How was the graduation?" she asked as we began her warm-up routine on the treadmill. I'd mentioned Marcus's ceremony the week before, and Amanda had been genuinely excited for me. "Complicated," I replied, adjusting the incline on her machine. "Let's focus on you today. How did that presentation go on Friday?" But Amanda wasn't easily deflected. She'd built her career on reading people and situations, and she could clearly sense something was wrong. "Linda, you look like someone who needs to talk. What happened?" As we moved through her workout routine, I found myself sharing more than I'd intended. Amanda listened while performing perfect squats, nodding thoughtfully as I described the seating arrangements, the casual dismissal, and the revelation about Dr. Patricia Webb. "Wait," Amanda said, pausing mid-rep during her bicep curls. "Did you say Dr. Patricia Webb? Tall woman, probably in her 50s, very polished, speaks with a slight Boston accent?" I felt my heart rate spike in a way that had nothing to do with our workout. "You know her?" Amanda set down her weights and faced me directly. "Linda, Dr. Patricia Webb tried to destroy my marriage 2 years ago. She was the counselor my ex-husband's mother insisted we see when we were having problems. That woman has a very specific agenda, and it's not about healing families." The pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know I was solving began clicking into place. "What do you mean, specific agenda?" "She specializes in what she calls family optimization," Amanda said, making air quotes with obvious distaste. "Basically, she helps wealthy families eliminate what she considers problematic relationships. In my case, she convinced my mother-in-law that I was a gold digger who was holding my husband back from his true potential. She never actually met me for a session, but she spent months coaching my husband on how to establish healthy boundaries with me. My blood ran cold. The language was almost identical to what David had described. What happened? My husband started pulling away, questioning everything about our relationship, making me feel like I was somehow toxic for wanting a normal marriage. Dr. Webb had convinced him that my career ambitions were threatening his masculinity, that I was manipulating him emotionally. It took me months to realize that everything he was saying sounded like it came from a script. Amanda resumed her workout, but her movements were more aggressive now, fueled by remembered anger. The final straw was when I discovered she'd been billing his mother for sessions where they discussed my psychological profile, based entirely on secondhand information. She'd created this detailed analysis of my supposed mental health issues without ever meeting me. That sounds completely unethical, I said, though even as I spoke, I was wondering what kind of psychological profile Dr. Webb might have created for me. It is unethical, and it would have been illegal if I could have proven it. But Dr. Webb is very careful about documentation. Technically, she was providing therapy to my husband about his family relationships. The fact that she was systematically poisoning him against me was just collateral damage. Amanda finished her set and grabbed her water bottle, taking a long drink before continuing. The marriage didn't survive, obviously, but here's the thing that might interest you. Dr. Webb has a very particular clientele: wealthy families who want to eliminate inconvenient relatives, ex-wives who are still too involved with their children, adult children who haven't separated properly from their parents. She frames it as healthy family dynamics, but what she's really doing is helping rich people cut ties with anyone who doesn't fit their image. The implications hit me like a weight dropping on my chest. So if Jessica and Robert were concerned about Marcus's relationship with me, they could hire Dr. Webb to fix it, Amanda finished grimly. And she'd convince Marcus that distancing himself from you was his own idea, for his own psychological health. She's very good at making her targets feel like they're choosing to change rather than being manipulated into it. After Amanda left, I couldn't concentrate on my remaining clients. During my break between sessions, I found myself researching Dr. Patricia Webb online. Her website was professionally designed and filled with impressive credentials. She had degrees from Harvard and Johns Hopkins, decades of experience in family therapy, and glowing testimonials from clients praising her ability to help them achieve healthier family dynamics. But as I dug deeper, I began to notice patterns in the testimonials. Many of them mentioned establishing appropriate boundaries and overcoming enmeshed relationships. Several specifically thanked Dr. Webb for helping them prioritize their nuclear family over extended family obligations. The language was consistent, almost formulaic, as if she was selling the same solution to different families. I called the fitness center's business manager and asked for an extended lunch break. There was something I needed to investigate, and it couldn't wait until after work. Dr. Patricia Webb's office was located in an upscale medical building in Cherry Creek, the same affluent area where Jessica and Robert lived. The building directory listed her as specializing in family systems therapy and relationship optimization. Even the terminology felt clinical and cold, reducing human connections to problems that needed to be optimized rather than relationships that needed to be nurtured. I didn't have an appointment, but I'd learned from years of dealing with bureaucratic systems that confidence and persistence could often get you further than official channels. I approached the receptionist, a young woman who looked like she probably paid more for her highlights than I made in a week. "I'd like to speak with Dr. Webb about her work with my son," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional. "I understand she's been providing family therapy services, and I have some questions about her approach." The receptionist glanced at her computer screen. "Do you have an appointment? Dr. Webb is very busy today." "I understand she's busy, but this concerns the welfare of my family. I only need a few minutes." There was something in my tone that must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation, because the receptionist picked up her phone and had a brief, hushed conversation. After a moment, she hung up and looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Dr. Webb can see you for a few minutes between appointments. Please have a seat." The waiting room was designed to convey success and stability. Expensive? Furniture, fresh flowers, and carefully curated magazines created an atmosphere of refined professionalism. But there was something sterile about it too, as if the human messiness of real family problems had been sanitized away. After about 10 minutes, a tall woman in her early 50s emerged from an inner office. She was exactly as Amanda had described, polished, professional, and carrying herself with the kind of confidence that came from years of being the smartest person in the room. Her handshake was firm, her smile perfectly calibrated to be warm, without being personal. "Ms. Rodriguez, I understand you have questions about family therapy services. Please come into my office." Dr. Webb's office was an extension of the waiting room's aesthetic. Tasteful, expensive, and somehow impersonal, despite being filled with family photos and personal touches. She gestured for me to sit in a leather chair across from her desk, then settled into her own chair with the practiced ease of someone who'd conducted thousands of similar conversations. "How can I help you today?" she asked, her voice carrying just the right note of professional concern. "I understand you've been working with my son, Marcus Rodriguez, on family relationship issues. I'd like to understand what kind of advice you've been giving him about me." Dr. Webb's expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Calculation, maybe, or recognition. "I'm sorry, but client confidentiality prevents me from discussing specific therapeutic relationships. However, I'd be happy to talk with you about family dynamics in general terms." "General terms," I repeated. "Let me be more specific then. My son has been pulling away from me for months, using language about boundaries and enmeshment that sounds like it came straight from a psychology textbook. Yesterday, at his graduation, I felt like a stranger in his life. So either he's developed a sudden interest in therapeutic terminology on his own, or someone has been coaching him on how to manage his relationship with me." Dr. Webb leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers in a gesture that probably looked thoughtful to most people but struck me as condescending. Family relationships can be very complex, especially when adult children are trying to establish independence. Sometimes what feels like rejection to a parent is actually healthy development for their child. "And sometimes," I replied, "what looks like healthy development is actually manipulation disguised as therapy." For the first time since I'd entered her office, Dr. Webb's professional composure slipped slightly. The smile became more forced, the eye contact more intense. "That's quite an accusation, Ms. Rodriguez. Are you suggesting that professional therapeutic intervention is somehow inappropriate?" "I'm suggesting that a therapist who develops treatment plans for family relationships without ever meeting all the family members might be operating from incomplete information." Dr. Webb stood up, clearly signaling that our conversation was over. "I think perhaps you would benefit from some individual therapy yourself, Ms. Rodriguez. Family transitions can be very difficult for parents, especially when they've been overly involved in their adult children's lives. I can recommend several excellent therapists who specialize in helping parents navigate these changes." The dismissal was smooth and professional, but it was also revealing. She hadn't denied working with Marcus, hadn't claimed she didn't know who I was, and most tellingly, she'd immediately suggested that I was the one who needed therapy. It was a classic deflection technique. When confronted with criticism, turn the focus back on the critic's supposed psychological issues. As I left her office, I felt more determined than ever to understand exactly what Dr. Webb had been telling my son about me. But I also felt something else, a growing awareness that this situation was bigger than just one misguided therapist. If Amanda was right about Dr. Webb's clientele and methods, then Marcus wasn't just dealing with family therapy. He was caught in a carefully orchestrated campaign to remove me from his life. That afternoon, back at Mountain View Fitness Center, I threw myself into my work with an intensity that surprised even me. My 3 p.m. client was Jake Morrison, a 26-year-old professional athlete who trained with me during his off-season. Jake was exactly Marcus's age, and working with him usually reminded me of the positive relationship I used to have with my son. Today, however, the contrast was painful. "You're pushing harder than usual today," Jake observed as we moved through an intense circuit training routine. "Everything okay?" I realized I'd been setting a pace that was challenging even for a professional athlete. "Sorry, I'm working through some frustration. Let me dial it back." "Actually, don't," Jake said, grinning as he moved into the next exercise. "This is the best workout I've had all week. Whatever's frustrating you, it's making you an even better trainer." His comment stuck with me as we continued the session. Jake respected my expertise, trusted my judgment, and valued our professional relationship. He'd never suggested I was too old to understand his goals or too involved in his success. In fact, he often told other people about how working with me had improved his performance. "Can I ask you something personal?" I said as we moved into the cool-down phase of his workout. "Sure, shoot." "If your mother was a personal trainer, would you be embarrassed to introduce her to your friends?" Jake looked genuinely confused by the question. "Are you kidding? If my mom looked like you and could do what you do at your age, I'd be showing her off to everyone. Why would anyone be embarrassed about having a badass mother?" Why indeed? The question haunted me for the rest of the afternoon. Marcus had grown up watching me rebuild my life after his father left. He'd seen me go back to school to get my personal training certification, watched me build a client base from nothing, celebrated with me when I was promoted to senior trainer. When had my strength become something to be ashamed of instead of something to be proud of? That evening, I decided to do something I'd been avoiding for months. I called Marcus directly, bypassing the usual text message routine we'd fallen into. He answered on the 4th ring, and I could hear background noise that suggested he was at a restaurant or social gathering. "Mom, is everything okay? It's kind of late." It was 7:30 p.m., hardly late by any reasonable standard, but I let the comment pass. "I wanted to talk to you about yesterday, about the graduation." There was a pause, and I heard him moving to a quieter location. "What about it?" "Marcus, I felt like a stranger at your graduation, like I didn't belong there, and I need to understand why." Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, we've talked about this. I'm trying to establish some independence, create appropriate boundaries. It's not personal." There it was again, the therapeutic language that sounded nothing like my son's natural way of speaking. "Marcus, who taught you to talk like that? Establish independence and appropriate boundaries. That's not how you used to communicate with me." "Maybe I'm just growing up," he said. But there was something defensive in his tone that suggested even he didn't entirely believe what he was saying. "Growing up doesn't require cutting your mother out of your achievements," I replied. "I've been thinking about this, and I want to meet with Dr. Patricia Webb. All 3 of us together. I think there are some misunderstandings that need to be cleared up." The silence that followed was so long I thought the call might have dropped. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice carried a note of panic that confirmed everything I'd suspected. "Mom, that's not necessary. Dr. Webb and I have a good working relationship, and bringing you into it would just complicate things." "Complicate things how?" "Look, I can't explain it over the phone. It's complicated family dynamic stuff that you wouldn't really understand." I wouldn't understand my own family dynamics, involving my own son, and I wouldn't understand them. The condescension was breathtaking, especially coming from someone I'd raised to value education and critical thinking. "Marcus, I want you to listen to me very carefully," I said, letting steel enter my voice in a way that hadn't been there since he was a teenager testing limits. "I don't know what Dr. Webb has told you about healthy family relationships, but I know what an unhealthy family relationship looks like. It looks like a son who's ashamed of his mother for no reason he can articulate. It looks like a young man who's been convinced that the woman who sacrificed everything for his success is somehow holding him back. Mom, you're being dramatic. I'm being honest, and here's what's going to happen. I'm going to find out exactly what's been said about me in those therapy sessions, and I'm going to give you a chance to remember who your mother really is. What does that mean? For the first time in months, I felt completely certain about my next move. It means you're about to discover that this 58-year-old woman you're so embarrassed by is stronger, tougher, and more resilient than anyone in your new family gives me credit for. And if Dr. Webb thinks she can erase me from your life with a few therapy sessions, she's about to learn exactly how wrong she is. I hung up before Marcus could respond, my heart pounding with a combination of anger and determination. For too long, I'd been reacting to other people's narratives about who I was and what my relationship with my son should look like. But I'd built a career on helping people exceed expectations and push past limitations. If Dr. Patricia Webb wanted to test whether this mother was too old to fight for her son, she was about to get a demonstration that would leave no doubt about the answer. The war for Marcus's loyalty was just beginning, and I intended to win. The morning after my phone call with Marcus, I woke with the kind of clarity that comes after making a decision that changes everything. I'd spent months feeling confused and hurt by my son's behavior, but now I understood exactly what I was fighting against. Dr. Patricia Webb wasn't just a misguided therapist. She was a professional relationship destroyer, and she'd made the mistake of targeting the wrong mother. I arrived at Mountain View Fitness Center an hour early, before any of my clients were scheduled to arrive. The gym was empty except for the cleaning crew finishing their overnight shift, and I used the solitude to plan my next move. If Dr. Webb wanted to play psychological warfare, she was about to discover that she'd picked an opponent who understood combat in ways she'd never learned in graduate school. My first stop was the office of Sarah Chen, the fitness center's owner, and my boss for the past 12 years. Sarah was already at her desk despite the early hour, reviewing membership reports and scheduling spreadsheets. She looked up when I knocked on her open door, immediately sensing something different in my demeanor. "Linda, you're here early. Everything all right?" Sarah was more than just my employer. She'd been a mentor and friend since the day I'd walked into her gym as a newly divorced woman desperate for a career that would support my son and me. She'd taken a chance on someone with no formal fitness experience but plenty of determination, and she'd watched me build a reputation as one of the most effective trainers in Denver. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," I said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Have you ever heard of Dr. Patricia Webb?" Sarah's expression shifted immediately, becoming guarded in a way I'd never seen before. "Why are you asking about Patricia Webb?" The reaction told me everything I needed to know. "Because she's been providing therapy to my son, convincing him that I'm somehow toxic to his development. And based on your expression, I'm guessing you've had some experience with her yourself." Sarah closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, studying me carefully. "Linda, how much do you know about my divorce 3 years ago?" I knew the basics. Sarah had been married to a successful plastic surgeon who'd left her for a younger woman. The divorce had been contentious, particularly regarding custody of their teenage daughter, Emma. But Sarah had always been private about the details, and I'd respected her boundaries. "Not much," I admitted. "You've never been one to share personal drama." "That's because the drama was orchestrated by Dr. Patricia Webb," Sarah said grimly. "My ex-husband hired her to help him get full custody of Emma. She spent 6 months coaching him on how to document my instability and inappropriate behavior as evidence that I was an unfit mother." My heart sank. If Dr. Webb had targeted Sarah, a successful businesswoman and devoted mother, then no woman was safe from her manipulations. What kind of inappropriate behavior? Working too many hours at the gym, maintaining friendships with younger people, posting photos on social, media that showed me being physically active. Basically, everything that made me who I am became evidence that I was going through some kind of midlife crisis that made me unsuitable to parent a teenager. Sarah stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the gym floor where a few early morning members were beginning their workouts. The worst part was watching Emma start to pull away from me. Dr. Webb had convinced my ex-husband that I was using our daughter to fulfill my own emotional needs, and he started coaching Emma to establish healthy boundaries with me. The parallel to my situation with Marcus was chilling. How did it end? It almost didn't end well. Dr. Webb's strategy was working. The court was seriously considering awarding primary custody to my ex-husband. But then Emma's school counselor intervened. She'd noticed changes in Emma's behavior and asked some pointed questions about the family therapy she was receiving. When the counselor learned that Dr. Webb had never actually met me for a session, she filed a complaint with the state licensing board. Sarah turned back to face me, her expression fierce with remembered anger. It turns out Dr. Webb has a pattern of providing family therapy that involves extensive sessions with one family member about another family member without ever meeting the person being discussed. It's ethically questionable at best, and potentially fraudulent at worst. What happened to the custody case? Once the court learned about Dr. Webb's methods, they ordered an independent evaluation. Emma told the truth about how her father had been coaching her to criticize me, and the judge wasn't impressed. My ex-husband lost his bid for full custody, and Dr. Webb lost several clients when word got out about the investigation. I felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. If Dr. Webb had been investigated once, there might be grounds for another complaint. Did anything happen to her license? She received a formal reprimand and was required to complete additional ethics training. But she didn't lose her license, and she certainly didn't stop practicing. She just became more careful about her documentation. Sarah returned to her desk and pulled out a thick file folder. I've been keeping track of her activities since then, partly for my own peace of mind, and partly because I suspected she'd continue her pattern with other families. Would you like to see what I've found? The folder contained newspaper clippings, court documents, and printed emails spanning 3 years. As I reviewed the materials, a disturbing pattern emerged. Dr. Webb specialized in wealthy families where custody, inheritance, or family business control was at stake. In every case, she provided therapy that helped one family member systematically eliminate another from their life. There was the case of Margaret Thompson, a 62-year-old woman whose adult children had used Dr. Webb's services to have her declared mentally incompetent so they could control her estate. The case of David Kim, whose wife had worked with Dr. Webb to convince their teenage son that his father was emotionally abusive. The case of Linda Foster, the name similarity made my blood run cold, whose daughter-in-law had hired Dr. Webb to help establish boundaries that effectively cut Linda out of her grandchildren's lives. This is systematic, I said, looking up from the documents. She's not just a bad therapist, she's running a sophisticated operation to destroy family relationships for money. Exactly. And her clients aren't random people with family problems. They're wealthy individuals who want to eliminate inconvenient relatives without looking like the bad guys. Dr. Webb gives them psychological cover for what amounts to emotional abuse. I thought about Jessica and Robert Chen, their obvious wealth, their obvious desire to have Marcus fully integrated into their family. Sarah, what would you do if someone was using these tactics on Emma now? Sarah's smile was sharp as a blade. I'd fight back with everything I had, and I'd make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of person they were dealing with. That afternoon, I canceled my training sessions and drove to the University of Colorado Denver campus. If I was going to fight for my son, I needed to understand exactly how Dr. Webb had positioned me in his mind. Marcus was finishing his final week of classes before officially graduating, and I knew from our previous conversations that he spent most afternoons studying in the business school library. I found him at a corner table on the 3rd floor, surrounded by textbooks and legal pads covered with notes. He looked up when I approached, and I saw a flicker of the old warmth in his eyes before it was quickly replaced by wariness. "Mom? What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said, settling into the chair across from him before he could object. "And this time, we're going to talk honestly, without any therapeutic scripts or coached responses." Marcus glanced around, nervously, as if he expected Dr. Webb to materialize and rescue him from the conversation. "Mom, I'm really busy with finals prep. Can't this wait?" "It's waited long enough." "Marcus, I want you to tell me, in your own words, what you think is wrong with our relationship. Not what Dr. Webb has told you is wrong, not what Jessica and Robert think is wrong. What do you think is wrong?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly struggling to find words that were genuinely his own. It's complicated," he finally said. "Uncomplicate it for me." Marcus set down his pen and looked at me directly for the first time in months. "Honestly, I don't know anymore. 6 months ago, I could have given you a whole list of issues with boundaries and enmeshment and inappropriate involvement. But sitting here now, looking at you, I can't remember why any of that seemed so important." The admission gave me hope, but I could also see the confusion and conflict in his eyes. Dr. Webb's manipulation had been thorough, creating doubt about his own perceptions and feelings. "Marcus, when did you start feeling like I was a problem in your life?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like I started noticing things that had never bothered me before. The way you dressed, the way you talked about your work, the way you interacted with my friends. Dr. Webb helped me understand that these feelings were normal, that it was healthy for me to want more independence." "But you were already independent," I pointed out. "You'd been living on your own for years, making your own decisions, building your own life. What kind of independence were you missing?" Another long pause. "Independence from feeling responsible for your happiness." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Marcus, when have I ever made you responsible for my happiness?" "You haven't, exactly. But Dr. Webb explained that sometimes parents don't realize they're placing emotional burdens on their children. She said that the sacrifices you made for me created an implicit debt that I could never repay, and that this dynamic was preventing me from forming healthy relationships with other people." I felt rage building in my chest, but I forced myself to keep my voice calm. "And you believed that the woman who worked 3 jobs to support your education was somehow burdening you with debt?" When she put it that way, it made sense, Marcus said miserably. "She said that healthy families don't keep score of sacrifices, and that your constant reminders of what you'd given up for me were a form of emotional manipulation." "Marcus, when have I ever reminded you of my sacrifices to make you feel guilty?" He thought about it, and I could see him searching his memory for examples that didn't exist. You haven't really." But Dr. Webb said that the manipulation doesn't have to be direct. She said that just knowing about the sacrifices creates pressure. "So, your solution was to pretend I don't exist?" "No, that wasn't the solution. The solution was supposed to be healthy boundaries that would allow us to have a better relationship. But somehow, the boundaries just kept getting bigger, and the relationship kept getting smaller." I reached across the table and took his hand, and for the first time in months, he didn't pull away. "Marcus, what if I told you that Dr. Webb has done this exact same thing to other families? What if I told you that she has a pattern of taking loving relationships and turning them into sources of shame and guilt?" His eyes widened. "What do you mean?" I told him about Amanda Sterling's marriage, about Sarah's custody battle, about the folder full of documented cases where Dr. Webb had systematically destroyed family bonds for profit. As I spoke, I watched Marcus's expression, change from confusion to horror to anger. "She never told me she'd worked with other families like this," he said slowly. "She made it sound like our situation was unique, like she was helping me navigate a particularly complex relationship. Marcus, did Dr. Webb ever suggest that you might inherit money or property from Jessica and Robert's family if you distanced yourself from me?" The question clearly hit home. Marcus's face flushed, and he looked away. She didn't say it directly, but she did mention that blended families work best when everyone is clear about loyalties and priorities. She said that if I wanted to be truly accepted by Jessica and Robert, I needed to show that I was committed to their family unit. "And what about your commitment to me?" She said that clinging to childhood relationships was a sign of emotional immaturity. The clinical language made me sick, but it also made me furious. Dr. Webb had taken my son's natural love for his mother and pathologized it, turning it into evidence of psychological dysfunction. "Marcus, I want you to think about something. In all your sessions with Dr. Webb, did she ever ask you to describe positive aspects of our relationship? Did she ever explore why you might want to maintain a close bond with me?" He shook his head slowly. "No. It was always focused on problems and boundaries. She said that's what therapy was for, identifying and solving issues." "And did she ever suggest meeting with me to get my perspective on our relationship?" "I asked about that once, and she said it would be counterproductive. She said that including you would just trigger the old patterns and make it harder for me to establish independence." I felt pieces clicking into place. Dr. Webb had isolated Marcus from my perspective, fed him a steady diet of psychological jargon that reframed our loving relationship as unhealthy, and positioned herself as the expert who could help him achieve freedom from his supposedly burdensome mother. "Marcus, I need you to think very carefully about something. Before you started seeing Dr. Webb, what did you want from your relationship with me?" He was quiet for several minutes, and I could see him struggling to remember feelings that had been systematically undermined and replaced. I wanted to make you proud. I wanted to share my successes with you. I wanted you to be part of my life. But I also wanted to prove that I could succeed on my own. And what's wrong with any of that? Nothing, I guess. Dr. Webb said it was codependent, but looking back, it sounds pretty normal. It is normal, Marcus. It's what healthy families look like. Children grow up and become independent, but they don't have to cut their parents out of their lives to prove their autonomy. Marcus buried his face in his hands. "Oh God, Mom, what have I done? I've been such an asshole to you, and for what? Because some therapist convinced me that loving my mother was psychologically unhealthy?" I moved my chair around the table so I could put my arm around his shoulders. "You were manipulated by a professional manipulator. This isn't your fault." But I chose to believe her. I chose to treat you like you were the problem. You chose to trust someone you thought was helping you. That's not a character flaw, Marcus. That's human nature. We sat in the library for another hour, talking through months of confusion and hurt. Marcus told me about sessions where Dr. Webb had carefully deconstructed every positive memory he had of our relationship, reframing my support as overprotectiveness, my pride as vicarious living, my love as emotional manipulation. By the time we finished talking, I understood exactly how thoroughly she'd poisoned his perception of me. But I also understood something else. Dr. Webb had made a critical error in her campaign against me. She'd assumed that I would retreat, quietly, when faced with my son's rejection, that I would accept her professional assessment of my supposed psychological dysfunction. She'd underestimated the woman she was trying to erase. As Marcus and I left the library together, I made him a promise. I'm going to stop Dr. Webb from doing this to other families, and I'm going to make sure that Jessica and Robert understand exactly what they paid for when they hired her. What do you mean? I mean that if Dr. Webb wants to play games about who's too old and who's too young, who's strong and who's weak, who belongs in your life and who doesn't, then it's time for her to meet the real Linda Rodriguez. The woman who rebuilt her life from nothing, who built a career helping people exceed their limitations, and who's about to show everyone exactly what this 58-year-old mother is capable of. Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. "What can I do to help?" "Just be ready to watch your old mom prove that age is just a number, and that underestimating me was the biggest mistake Dr. Patricia Webb ever made." The plan came to me during my morning workout routine. As I was deadlifting 275 pounds, 25 more than my previous personal record. Sometimes the best ideas emerge when your body is pushed to its limits and your mind achieves perfect clarity. Dr. Patricia Webb had spent months convincing my son that I was too old, too involved, too much of everything that didn't fit her narrow definition of appropriate maternal behavior. She was about to discover that she'd picked the wrong woman to underestimate. I called Jessica Chen directly that afternoon, something I'd never done before. Her assistant put me through immediately, which told me that curiosity about Marcus's biological mother was stronger than any inconvenience my call might cause. "Linda, this is unexpected," Jessica said, her voice carefully neutral. "How can I help you?" "I'd like to invite you, Robert and Marcus, to Mountain View Fitness Center this Saturday morning. There's something I want to show all of you, and I think it will clear up some misconceptions about who I am and what I'm capable of." There was a pause. "What kind of misconceptions?" "The kind that Dr. Patricia Webb has been spreading about me being too old to be a meaningful part of Marcus's life. I'm going to demonstrate exactly how wrong that assessment is." Another pause, longer this time. "Linda, I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating directly that Dr. Webb has been hired to eliminate me from Marcus's life, and she's used unethical therapeutic techniques to convince him that his relationship with me is psychologically unhealthy. But before we discuss that, I want you to see who you're really dealing with." Jessica's voice became more cautious. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A fitness challenge. Me against anyone you choose. Marcus, Robert, even yourself if you're interested. Any athletic competition you think a 58-year-old woman couldn't handle. When I win, we're going to have a very honest conversation about Dr. Webb's methods and your family's role in financing them. And if you lose, I won't lose." The confidence in my voice must have intrigued her, because she agreed to the Saturday morning meeting. I spent the next 3 days preparing, not just physically but strategically. If I was going to expose Dr. Webb's manipulation, I needed more than just my word against hers. I needed evidence that would be impossible to dismiss. Amanda Sterling proved invaluable in this effort. Her marketing background had taught her how to research people thoroughly, and she used those skills to dig deeper into Dr. Webb's professional history. What she found was even more damning than Sarah's collection of newspaper clippings and court documents. "Linda, you need to see this," Amanda said, arriving at the gym Friday evening with a thick folder and her laptop. "I found Dr. Webb's financial records from her divorce proceedings 5 years ago. She's been making over $400,000 a year just from her family optimization services." The records showed a clear pattern. Dr. Webb charged premium rates for what she called intensive family restructuring, sessions that could last 6 months to 2 years and cost upwards of $50,000 per family. Her client list read like a who's who of Denver's wealthiest families, and in every case, the therapy resulted in the permanent estrangement of family members who had been deemed problematic. "Look at this," Amanda said, pointing to a specific entry in the financial documents. She received $75,000 from the Mitchell family for adolescent independence counseling. When I looked them up, their teenage daughter hasn't spoken to her biological father in 3 years, and now she's set to inherit everything when her stepfather dies. The pattern was clear and horrifying. Dr. Webb wasn't just destroying families, she was redistributing wealth and inheritance through psychological manipulation. Wealthy families paid her substantial fees to eliminate inconvenient relatives who might have claims on money, property, or family businesses. Amanda, this is criminal fraud disguised as therapy. It gets worse. I found emails between Dr. T. Webb and several attorneys who specialize in estate planning. They've been referring clients to each other. The lawyers handle the legal aspects of disinheritance, while Dr. Webb provides the psychological justification. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp Colorado sunshine that made everything seem possible. I arrived at Mountain View Fitness Center at 6 a.m. to prepare for what would either be my vindication or my complete humiliation. But as I went through my warm-up routine, I felt nothing but confidence. This was my domain, my expertise, my strength. Marcus arrived first, looking nervous but determined. We'd spent the previous evening talking through everything that had happened over the past year, and I could see the guilt and anger warring in his expression. He was angry at Dr. Webb for manipulating him, but he was even angrier at himself for allowing it to happen. "Mom, are you sure about this?" he asked as I finished my stretching routine. "I mean, I believe in you, but what if something goes wrong?" "Marcus, I've been preparing my whole life for this moment, not just physically, but emotionally." Dr. Webb made a fundamental error when she assumed that being 58 meant being weak. She's about to learn how wrong she was. Jessica and Robert arrived at exactly 8 a.m., accompanied by someone I hadn't expected, Dr. Patricia Webb herself. She looked as polished and professional as ever, but there was something predatory in her eyes as she surveyed the gym environment. She clearly viewed this as another opportunity to demonstrate my supposed instability. "Linda," Dr. Webb said with false warmth, "how interesting to meet you in your natural habitat. I have to say, this is quite an unusual approach to family therapy." "This isn't therapy," I replied calmly. "This is a demonstration. You've spent months telling my son that I'm too old to be relevant in his life. Today, I'm going to show everyone exactly how relevant I am." Sarah Chen had arrived early to ensure the gym was set up properly for what we had planned. She'd also brought along Jake Morrison, my athlete client, and several other trainers who wanted to witness what promised to be an epic showdown. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. "What exactly are you proposing?" Robert asked, looking around at the equipment with obvious uncertainty. "A series of fitness challenges," I announced. "Cardiovascular endurance, strength training, flexibility, and athletic skill. I'll compete against anyone you choose. Marcus, you, or if Dr. Webb thinks age is just a mental limitation, she's welcome to participate herself." Dr. Webb's smile became strained. "I hardly think physical competition is an appropriate way to resolve family issues." "You made this about my age and capabilities," I replied. "So let's test those capabilities directly." Marcus stepped forward. "I'll do it. If Mom wants to prove she's not too old for anything, I'll be her competition." For the next 2 hours, I systematically demonstrated that chronological age had nothing to do with physical or mental capability. The cardiovascular challenge involved a 30-minute high-intensity interval training session on the rowing machine. I not only matched Marcus's pace, but exceeded it, finishing with a time that would have been impressive for someone half my age. The strength training portion involved a series of compound lifts: deadlifts, squats, bench press, and overhead press. I lifted weights that Marcus couldn't handle, executed movements with perfect form despite the heavy resistance, and maintained endurance throughout the entire session. The flexibility challenge showcased years of yoga and mobility work, demonstrating range of motion that put Marcus's young joints to shame. But the athletic skill portion was where I truly dominated. We set up an obstacle course that combined agility, coordination, power, and mental focus. I navigated it with the fluid precision of someone who had spent decades perfecting movement patterns, while Marcus struggled with obstacles that required both strength and technique. By the end of the demonstration, Marcus was exhausted and humbled. Jessica and Robert were visibly impressed, and Dr. Webb looked like someone who was rapidly recalculating her assessment of the situation. "That was incredible," Robert said, genuine admiration in his voice. "Linda, I had no idea you were capable of that level of performance." "Most people don't," I replied, barely breathing hard despite the intensive workout. "Because they make assumptions based on age rather than observing actual capability." Dr. Webb cleared her throat, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Physical fitness is certainly admirable, but it doesn't address the underlying family dynamics that—" "Actually, it addresses them perfectly," I interrupted. "Because you've been telling my son that I'm too old, too weak, too irrelevant to be part of his life. But what you've really been doing is projecting your own limitations onto me." I walked to the bench where Amanda had placed the folder of evidence we'd compiled. "Dr. Webb, would you like to explain to Jessica and Robert how much they've paid you to destroy my relationship with Marcus? Or would you prefer that I share what we've discovered about your financial arrangements with other wealthy families?" The color drained from Dr. Webb's face. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." I opened the folder and began reading from the financial documents. $75,000 from the Mitchell family, $60,000 from the Henderson estate, $90,000 from the Chang Family Trust, all for family optimization services that resulted in permanent estrangement between family members. Jessica looked shocked. "Patricia, is this true?" Dr. Webb's professional composure was finally cracking. "Those are confidential therapeutic relationships. This woman has no right to access private financial information." "Actually, these are public records from your divorce proceedings," Amanda said, stepping forward with her laptop. "And they show a clear pattern of financial fraud, disguised as therapy." Robert's expression had shifted from confusion to anger. "Are you saying we paid you to manipulate Marcus against his mother?" "I provided professional therapeutic services to help Marcus establish healthy boundaries. You provided a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation," I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had just demonstrated exactly what she was capable of. "You convinced my son that loving his mother was a sign of emotional dysfunction. You pathologized normal family relationships to justify separating us. And you did it all for money." Marcus stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Dr. Webb, you told me that my relationship with my mom was preventing me from forming healthy attachments to other people, but the only unhealthy thing was believing you." Dr. Webb tried one last desperate deflection. "This is highly irregular. Physical demonstrations and financial accusations have no place in therapeutic discourse. There is no therapeutic discourse here," I said firmly. "Because you're not a real therapist. You're a con artist who uses psychological jargon to justify breaking up families for profit." Sarah Chen stepped forward with another folder. "Dr. Webb, I think you should know that we've filed a formal complaint with the state licensing board. Again. This time with extensive documentation of your pattern of unethical practices." The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Webb looked around the room, clearly realizing that her carefully constructed professional facade had been completely demolished. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the gym, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. After she left, Jessica turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Linda, I am so sorry. We had no idea what she was really doing. We thought we were helping Marcus become more independent." "You were trying to help," I replied gently. "Dr. Webb is very good at making her manipulation look like legitimate therapy." Robert nodded grimly. "We'll be canceling all future payments to her immediately. And if there's anything we can do to repair the damage she's caused—" "There is something," I said. I want you to see me as I really am, not as Dr. Webb portrayed me. I'm not trying to compete with you for Marcus's affection. I'm not trying to hold him back from success. I'm simply a mother who loves her son and wants to be part of his life." Marcus walked over and wrapped me in a hug that felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. "Mom, I'm so sorry for everything. I can't believe I let someone convince me that you were anything other than amazing. You were manipulated by a professional," I reminded him. "But it's over now." Jessica wiped her eyes and smiled. "Linda, would you be willing to join us for dinner tonight? I think we have a lot of catching up to do, and I'd love to hear about your work here. What you demonstrated today was extraordinary." As we made plans for the evening, I realized that Dr. Webb's greatest mistake hadn't been underestimating my physical capabilities. It had been underestimating my determination to fight for my son. She'd assumed that a 58-year-old woman would quietly accept being erased from her child's life. Instead, she'd awakened a force that was far stronger than she'd ever imagined. 3 months later, Dr. Patricia Webb's license was permanently revoked after a state investigation revealed a pattern of unethical practices spanning nearly a decade. Several of her former clients came forward with similar stories of family manipulation and financial exploitation. She currently faces criminal fraud charges in 3 states. Marcus and I have rebuilt our relationship stronger than ever. He's working at a nonprofit organization that provides business consulting to disadvantaged communities, using his MBA to help people who remind him of where he came from. Jessica and Robert have become genuine friends, and they often tell people about the day they watched a 58-year-old woman demonstrate that age is nothing more than a number. As for me, I've expanded my role at Mountain View Fitness Center to include specialized training for people over 50 who want to prove that their best years are still ahead of them. My motto, printed on every business card and posted on the gym wall, comes from that Saturday morning when I changed everything. Age is just a number. Strength is a choice. Never let anyone tell you you're too old to be extraordinary. Because sometimes, when someone tries to convince you that you're too old, too weak, or too irrelevant to matter, the best response isn't an argument. It's a demonstration. And if you're going to demonstrate, you might as well make it unforgettable. The weeks following Dr. Webb's humiliating exit from Mountain View Fitness Center brought changes I hadn't anticipated. What started as a personal battle to reclaim my relationship with Marcus had evolved into something much larger. A movement that would impact dozens of families across Colorado and beyond. The first sign that our victory was resonating beyond our immediate circle came 3 days after the confrontation. Amanda Sterling called me at the gym, her voice bubbling with excitement that was unusual for her typically composed demeanor. "Linda, you need to see the news. Channel 7 is running an investigative series on Dr. Webb, and they're featuring your story as the centerpiece." I found the news segment online during my lunch break, watching with amazement as investigative reporter Michelle Torres laid out the scope of Dr. Webb's operation. The piece opened with footage of me completing the obstacle course challenge, demonstrating physical capabilities that defied every stereotype about women my age. But what followed was even more powerful. Interviews with other families who had been torn apart by Dr. Webb's manipulation. There was Margaret Thompson, the 62-year-old woman whose adult children had tried to have her declared incompetent. She sat in the studio, poised and articulate, explaining how Dr. Webb had coached her son and daughter to document her supposed mental decline. They started treating me like I was senile because this woman convinced them that wanting to maintain my independence was a sign of cognitive deterioration, Margaret said. It took 2 years and a team of lawyers to prove that there was nothing wrong with my mind, except that I disagreed with their plans for my money. The segment included David, Kim, whose wife had worked with Dr. Webb to convince their teenage son that his father was emotionally abusive. David's voice cracked as he described watching his relationship with his boy disintegrate under the weight of manufactured psychological concerns. "She turned normal parental guidance into evidence of manipulation," he said. "My son stopped talking, To me, because this woman convinced him that caring about his future was a form of control. But the most heartbreaking interview was with Linda Foster, the grandmother whose daughter-in-law had used Dr. Webb's services to cut her off from her grandchildren. Linda sat in her empty living room, surrounded by photos of grandchildren she hadn't seen in 2 years. They were told that my involvement in their lives was preventing their parents from bonding properly with them, she explained. This woman took 3 generations of love and turned it into a psychological disorder. As the news segment continued, I realized that our confrontation had provided the catalyst these families needed to speak publicly about their experiences. For the first time, Dr. Webb's victims had proof that they weren't isolated cases, that there was a systematic pattern of family destruction being carried out under the guise of professional therapy. The segment concluded with Michelle Torres standing outside Dr. Webb's now empty office building. Dr. Patricia Webb declined to be interviewed for this story, Torres reported. Her office manager informed us that she has relocated her practice to Arizona, though state licensing boards in multiple states are now investigating her methods. That evening, Marcus called me with news that provided another piece of the puzzle we'd been assembling. "Mom, I heard from Ashley Williams today. Remember her from my graduation? She wanted to apologize for not speaking up sooner." Ashley had been the young woman at the graduation ceremony who had shown kindness when others were confused by the family dynamics. Apparently, she'd recognized the signs of Dr. Webb's manipulation because her own family had been targeted by a similar therapist in California. She said there's a whole network of these people, Marcus continued. Therapists who specialize in what they call family restructuring for wealthy clients. It's like a psychological consulting service for people who want to eliminate inconvenient relatives without looking like the bad guys. The revelation was staggering, but not entirely surprising. If Dr. Webb could make hundreds of thousands of dollars per year destroying families in Denver, there was undoubtedly a market for similar services in other wealthy communities across the country. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call that would change the trajectory of my life in ways I never could have imagined. The caller introduced herself as Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a clinical psychologist and professor at the University of Colorado's School of Medicine. Ms. Rodriguez, I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly. I've been following the news coverage of your situation with Dr. Webb, and I'm wondering if you'd be interested in helping us with a research project. Dr. Rodriguez explained that she'd been investigating unethical practices in family therapy for several years, but had struggled to find victims willing to speak publicly about their experiences. The shame and confusion that Dr. Webb's manipulations created made most families reluctant to expose what had happened to them. Your willingness to fight back publicly has encouraged other families to come forward, Dr. Rodriguez said. We now have enough cases to document a clear pattern of abuse, but we need someone who understands the victim's perspective to help us develop intervention strategies. The research position she was offering would allow me to maintain my training career while working part-time with the university to study and expose these unethical practices. It was an opportunity to turn my personal victory into a tool for helping other families. What would the work involve? I asked, though I was already leaning toward accepting whatever she proposed. We're developing a certification program for legitimate family therapists that will help them identify and counter these manipulation techniques. We're also creating resources for families who suspect they're being targeted. And eventually, we hope to lobby for stronger licensing requirements that will make it harder for people like Dr. Webb to operate. The following Monday, I walked into the University of Colorado's psychology department as their newest research associate. The title felt surreal. At 58, I was embarking on an academic career that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. But then again, the past year had taught me that most limitations are artificial constructs that exist primarily in other people's minds. My first assignment was to review case files from families who had contacted the university after seeing the news coverage. Reading through their stories was both heartbreaking and infuriating. The patterns were consistent. wealthy families hiring therapists to provide psychological justification for cutting ties with relatives who posed financial or social inconveniences. There was the case of Robert Chen, no relation to Jessica, whose elderly mother had been declared emotionally manipulative when she objected to her son's plans to sell the family business. The therapist had convinced Robert that his mother's attachment to the company was preventing him from reaching his full potential as an entrepreneur. Another file described the Martinez family, where a stepmother had hired a therapist to help her teenage stepson establish healthy boundaries with his biological mother. The therapy sessions had focused exclusively on the supposed psychological damage caused by maintaining contact with his dysfunctional birth family. Each case followed the same blueprint that Dr. Webb had used with Marcus. The therapist would meet exclusively with one family member, gradually introducing concepts about toxic relationships and healthy boundaries. Over time, the targeted relative would be reframed as a psychological burden rather than a loved family member. The process was slow enough that the manipulation wasn't obvious, but systematic enough that the results were predictable. As I compiled data from dozens of cases, I began to understand the scope of what we were dealing with. This wasn't just about a few unethical therapists. It was about an entire industry that had developed around providing psychological cover for financial and social manipulation. 3 months into my university work, I received an unexpected visitor at Mountain View Fitness Center. I was training Jake Morrison for his upcoming season when Sarah Chen approached with a nervous-looking young woman I didn't recognize. "Linda, this is Catherine Webb," Sarah said. "She's Dr. Webb's daughter, and she has something she wants to tell you." Catherine appeared to be in her early 30s, with the same polished appearance as her mother but carrying an obvious burden of guilt and anxiety. She waited until Jake finished his session before approaching me directly. "Ms. Rodriguez, I know you have every reason to hate my mother, but I need you to know that not everyone in our family supported what she was doing." Catherine explained that she'd been estranged from her mother for over 5 years because of Dr. Webb's attempts to manipulate her own family relationships. She tried to convince my husband that my relationship with my father was psychologically unhealthy. When that didn't work, she started suggesting that I had inherited mental health issues that made me unsuitable to raise children. The irony was staggering. Dr. Webb had used her own techniques on her own daughter, destroying their relationship in the process. "I have something that might help your research," Catherine continued, reaching into her purse to retrieve a flash drive. Before I cut contact with her, I copied files from her computer, training materials, client communications, even recorded phone calls where she's coaching other therapists on these techniques. The flash drive contained a treasure trove of evidence that exceeded anything we'd hoped to find. There were PowerPoint presentations titled "Family Restructuring for High Net Worth Clients" and "Psychological Strategies for Inheritance Optimization." There were email exchanges between Dr. Webb and estate planning attorneys, discussing specific families and the most effective ways to eliminate inconvenient heirs. Most damning of all were the recorded phone calls where Dr. Webb coached other therapists on her methods. Her voice was calm and professional as she explained how to identify families where relatives could be profitably eliminated, how to gradually introduce psychological concepts that would justify cutting ties, and how to document the process in ways that would hold up under legal scrutiny. "The key is patience," Dr. Webb's voice explained in one recording. "You can't rush the process. It takes time to convince someone that their natural family bonds are actually psychological dysfunction. But once you establish that framework, they'll do the emotional work of separation themselves." Armed with Catherine's evidence, Dr. Elena Rodriguez and I were able to expand our research exponentially. We identified a network of at least 30 therapists across 12 states who were using similar techniques. The financial records we uncovered showed that the industry was generating millions of dollars annually by destroying family relationships for profit. 6 months after our initial confrontation with Dr. Webb, I found myself testifying before a Colorado State Legislative Committee, about the need for stronger regulations in family therapy. The hearing room was packed with families who had been victimized by these practices, and their collective presence created an atmosphere of righteous determination. "Honorable committee members," I began. "When I walked into my son's graduation ceremony last year, I thought I was celebrating his achievement. I had no idea I was walking into a psychological war zone where my relationship with my child had been systematically undermined by a professional con artist." I described Dr. Webb's methods in detail, explaining how she had taken Marcus's natural desire for independence and weaponized it against our family bond. I shared the evidence we'd compiled about the broader network of therapists who were profiting from family destruction. "These people aren't providing therapy," I continued. "They're providing psychological cover for financial and social manipulation. They're taking the most fundamental human relationships, between parents and children, between grandparents and grandchildren, and turning them into pathology that needs to be cured." The committee listened intently as I described the legislation we were proposing. New licensing requirements would mandate that family therapists meet with all affected family members before developing treatment plans. Therapists would be required to disclose their financial relationships with clients and any third parties who might benefit from their recommendations. Most importantly, state licensing boards would be given stronger tools to investigate and punish therapists who engaged in these practices. Marcus testified as well, describing his experience from the perspective of someone who had been manipulated. "I want to be clear that I'm not claiming I was brainwashed or that I'm not responsible for my actions," he said. "But Dr. Webb used sophisticated psychological techniques to convince me that my love for my mother was actually a form of dysfunction. She took normal family emotions and reframed them as problems that needed to be solved." The hearing concluded with testimony from Dr. Elena Rodriguez about the research we'd conducted. She presented data showing that families victimized by these practices suffered long-term psychological damage comparable to other forms of emotional abuse. Children who were convinced to cut ties with their parents experienced higher rates of depression and anxiety. Parents who were systematically eliminated from their children's lives showed symptoms consistent with grief and trauma. The damage these practices cause extends far beyond the immediate financial benefits they provide to certain family members, Dr. Rodriguez explained. "We're looking at generational trauma that will affect families for decades to come." The legislation passed unanimously, making Colorado the first state to specifically address psychological manipulation in family therapy. Within a year, 8 other states had passed similar laws, and federal legislation was being considered to address the interstate nature of the problem. As for Dr. Webb herself, the criminal fraud charges caught up with her in Arizona. She was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. The civil lawsuits filed by her victims resulted in millions of dollars in damages, though no amount of money could fully compensate for the relationships she had destroyed. Today, I split my time between training clients at Mountain View Fitness Center and working with the university's Family Therapy Ethics program. We've helped reunite over 40 families who were torn apart by these practices, and we've trained hundreds of legitimate therapists to recognize and counter manipulation techniques. Marcus has become one of my strongest allies in this work, often speaking at conferences about his experience as a victim of therapeutic manipulation. Our relationship is stronger than it ever was before Dr. Webb's intervention, forged in the fire of surviving a coordinated attempt to destroy it. Jessica and Robert remain close friends, and they've become vocal advocates for ethical family therapy practices. They've used their financial resources to support research into these issues and to help other families who can't afford the legal costs of fighting back against manipulation. But perhaps the most rewarding aspect of this journey has been the personal transformation it catalyzed. At 58, I discovered capabilities I never knew I possessed. Not just physical strength, but intellectual resilience, emotional fortitude, and the ability to turn personal pain into purposeful action. When people ask me what I learned from this experience, I tell them that age is irrelevant when you're fighting for something that matters. The women and men who try to dismiss us because of our years on this planet fundamentally misunderstand what aging actually means. It doesn't mean becoming weaker or less relevant. It means accumulating wisdom, experience, and the kind of perspective that only comes from surviving life's challenges. Dr. Webb made the mistake of assuming that a 58-year-old woman would quietly accept being erased from her son's success story. Instead, she awakened a force that was far more powerful than she could have imagined. A mother's love combined with a lifetime of accumulated strength and the absolute refusal to be diminished by anyone's narrow expectations. The fitness center still displays the motto I adopted after our victory. Age is just a number. Strength is a choice. Never let anyone tell you you're too old to be extraordinary. But I've added a second line that captures the deeper lesson of this experience. And when they try to make you disappear, show them exactly why that's impossible. Because sometimes the best response to being underestimated isn't an argument. It's a demonstration that changes everything. 2 years after the courtroom victory that sent Dr. Patricia Webb to federal prison, I received an invitation that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of my battle for Marcus's loyalty. The American Psychological Association wanted me to deliver the keynote address at their national conference on family therapy ethics. The woman who had been dismissed as too old to understand modern family dynamics was now being asked to educate thousands of mental health professionals about protecting families from manipulation. Standing in the convention center's main auditorium, looking out at an audience of distinguished psychologists, psychiatrists, and family therapists, I felt the weight of every family that had been torn apart by predatory practices. The speech I was about to deliver wasn't just about my personal victory. It was about fundamentally changing how the mental health profession understood and prevented the weaponization of therapy. 3 years ago, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. I was a fitness trainer who thought therapy was about healing. I believed that mental health professionals were dedicated to strengthening family bonds, not destroying them for profit. I was wrong about some therapists, but I was absolutely right about the power of refusing to accept other people's limitations. The audience was silent, completely focused on what had become known in professional circles as the Rodriguez case, the investigation that had exposed an entire network of therapists who specialized in family destruction for wealthy clients. But my story had evolved far beyond exposing Dr. Webb's criminal enterprise. It had become a testament to the strength that emerges when someone decides they will not be erased. I described the morning of Marcus's graduation, when I had stood in general seating while his stepfamily occupied premium seats, feeling like a stranger at my own son's achievement. I explained how Dr. Webb had systematically convinced Marcus that loving his mother was psychologically unhealthy, turning normal family bonds into pathology that needed professional intervention. Dr. Webb made a fundamental error, I told the audience. She assumed that a 58-year-old woman would quietly disappear when faced with professional psychological assessment. She underestimated the strength that comes not from youth, but from experience. She forgot that mothers who have rebuilt their lives from nothing possess a resilience that can't be manipulated away. The speech continued with detailed analysis of the manipulation techniques that Dr. Webb and her network had employed. I'd spent 2 years studying these methods with Dr. Elena Rodriguez and our research team, developing frameworks that legitimate therapists could use to recognize and counter family manipulation attempts. The key to understanding these predatory practices is recognizing that they follow a predictable pattern, I explained. First, the therapist establishes exclusive access to one family member, usually the person who stands to benefit financially from cutting ties with relatives. Second, they gradually introduce concepts about toxic relationships and healthy boundaries that reframe normal family connections as psychological dysfunction. Third, they provide ongoing coaching that helps the client justify eliminating family members while maintaining the appearance of therapeutic growth. During the question and answer session that followed my presentation, a young therapist raised her hand with a question that went straight to the heart of why this work mattered so much to me. Ms. Rodriguez, how do we help families who have already been victimized by these practices? Some of the damage seems irreversible. No damage is irreversible, I replied firmly. But healing requires acknowledging what really happened. Families need to understand that they weren't dealing with legitimate therapy. They were dealing with sophisticated psychological manipulation designed to break them apart. Once they understand that, they can begin the real work of rebuilding. After the conference, I flew back to Denver with a renewed sense of purpose. The work Dr. Rodriguez and I had been doing at the university was expanding beyond research into active intervention. We'd established the Family Reconnection Center, a clinic that specialized in helping families recover from therapeutic manipulation. The waiting list was 6 months long, filled with families from across the country who had heard about our success in reuniting parents with alienated children. My first client that Monday morning was Helen Vasquez, a 64-year-old grandmother whose daughter had used a Dr. Webb-trained therapist to justify cutting her off from her grandchildren. Helen had been told that her boundary violations and emotional enmeshment with her grandchildren were preventing them from bonding properly with their parents. "I don't understand what I did wrong," Helen said, tears streaming down her face, as she sat in my office. "I loved those children. I helped raise them while their parents were building their careers. Now they won't even take my phone calls." Helen's story was heartbreakingly familiar. Like so many grandparents who had been targeted by these practices, she'd been reframed as an obstacle to healthy family development rather than a source of love and support. The psychological language used to justify her exclusion was identical to what Dr. Webb had used against me, clinical terminology that made normal family affection sound pathological. "Helen, I want you to understand something very clearly," I said, leaning forward to make sure she was listening. "You didn't do anything wrong. You were targeted by people who profit from breaking up families. Everything they told your daughter about your relationship with your grandchildren was calculated to achieve one goal: removing you from their lives." Over the following months, I worked with Helen to document the manipulation that had been used against her family. We uncovered emails between her daughter and the therapist that revealed a systematic campaign to reframe Helen's grandmother role as psychologically harmful. The therapist had coached Helen's daughter on how to interpret every expression of grandmotherly love as evidence of boundary violations. The breakthrough came when Helen's teenage grandson reached out to her directly, having grown old enough to question why his beloved grandmother had suddenly disappeared from his life. Through careful family mediation sessions, we were able to expose the manipulation that had been used to separate them. The reunion between Helen and her grandchildren was one of the most emotionally powerful moments I'd witnessed in 2 years of family reconnection work. But the case that would become the cornerstone of our research involved a family whose experience made even Dr. Webb's manipulation of Marcus seem simple by comparison. Richard and Maria Santos contacted our center after reading about our work in a national magazine article. Their situation involved multiple generations and a level of psychological manipulation that was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. The Santos family owned a successful chain of restaurants throughout the Southwest, built over 3 generations from a single taco stand that Richard's grandfather had opened in the 1950s. When Richard's father died, leaving him as the primary heir to the family business, his stepmother hired a team of therapists to help her teenage son claim a larger share of the inheritance. The psychological campaign against the Santos family lasted 3 years and involved 4 different therapists. Working in coordination, Richard's stepmother was coached on how to document his supposedly erratic behavior and poor judgment. His own son was convinced that maintaining loyalty to his father was preventing him from developing his own identity. Even Richard's elderly mother was targeted, with therapists suggesting that her involvement in the family business was a sign of cognitive decline that required professional intervention. They didn't just try to destroy individual relationships. Richard explained during our first consultation. They tried to destroy the entire concept of family loyalty. They turned 3 generations of love and tradition into psychological pathology that needed to be treated. The Santos case became the foundation for our most ambitious project yet, a comprehensive study of multi-generational family manipulation that would eventually be published in the Journal of Family Psychology. Working with Richard and Maria, we documented how sophisticated psychological manipulation could be used to redistribute wealth and power within families while making the process appear to be legitimate therapeutic intervention. The research revealed patterns that extended far beyond individual cases. In wealthy families, these practices were being used to eliminate inconvenient heirs, consolidate business control, and redirect inheritance to preferred family members. The therapists involved weren't just destroying relationships. They were facilitating the transfer of millions of dollars in assets through psychological manipulation. Our findings caught the attention of federal investigators who were already looking into financial fraud in the mental health industry. The Santos case provided the evidence they needed to launch a nationwide investigation into what prosecutors called therapeutic racketeering, the systematic use of psychological manipulation to commit financial crimes. As the investigation expanded, I found myself testifying not just about Dr. Webb's specific crimes, but about the entire industry that had developed around family destruction for profit. The scope of the problem was staggering. Hundreds of therapists across dozens of states were using similar techniques to generate millions of dollars in revenue while devastating families in the process. The federal case that emerged from our research led to the largest mental health fraud prosecution in American history. 17 therapists were indicted on charges ranging from wire fraud to racketeering conspiracy. The financial records seized during the investigation showed that the network had generated over $50 million in revenue by systematically destroying family relationships. But beyond the legal victories and professional recognition, the most meaningful aspect of this journey remained the personal transformations I witnessed every day at the Family Reconnection Center. Parents who had been convinced their love was toxic learned to trust their instincts again. Children who had been manipulated into cutting ties with their families discovered the strength to rebuild those connections. Grandparents who had been systematically excluded from their grandchildren's lives found pathways back to the relationships that mattered most to them. One of the most powerful reunions involved a case that arrived at our center through an unexpected channel. Dr. Webb's own daughter, Catherine, had been working to rebuild her relationship with her father, who had been systematically alienated from the family through his ex-wife's manipulation tactics. Catherine's father, Dr. James Webb, was himself a respected psychologist who had been professionally destroyed by his ex-wife's campaign against him. She used her own therapeutic training to convince everyone that I was mentally unstable, Dr. Webb told me during our first meeting. She documented every argument we had, every moment of frustration I showed during our divorce, and presented it as evidence of psychological instability. Even my own colleagues started to question my professional competence. The irony was profound. Dr. Patricia Webb had learned her family destruction techniques by watching them used against her own ex-husband. She had seen how effective psychological manipulation could be in isolating people from their support systems, and she had built an entire career around monetizing those techniques. Working with Catherine and her father provided insights into the generational nature of these manipulation patterns. Dr. Patricia Webb hadn't just been a criminal therapist. She had been a victim who became a perpetrator, using the tactics that had been employed against her family to destroy other families for profit. The reunification of Catherine with her father became a model for our work with other families, where the manipulation had spanned multiple generations. We developed protocols for addressing the complex trauma that results when family members are turned against each other through sophisticated psychological techniques. 3 years after my confrontation with Dr. Webb at Mountain View Fitness Center, I received news that brought the story full circle in a way I never could have anticipated. Dr. Patricia Webb was being released from federal prison after serving her full sentence. The terms of her parole prohibited her from practicing therapy, but they didn't prevent her from contacting former victims to express remorse for her actions. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, handwritten on plain stationery with a return address from a halfway house in Phoenix. Dr. Webb's handwriting was as precise and controlled as her speaking voice had been, but the words themselves carried a vulnerability I had never seen from her. "Dear Ms. Rodriguez," the letter began, "I know that no apology can undo the damage I caused to your family and the many other families I manipulated over the years. I am writing not to seek your forgiveness, but to acknowledge the full scope of what I did and to provide information that might help prevent others from following the path I chose." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing aspects of her operation that hadn't emerged during the federal investigation. Dr. Webb described the psychological techniques she had been taught by mentors who specialized in family manipulation, the financial incentives that had driven her to expand her practice, and the gradual process by which she had convinced herself that destroying families was actually helping them. "I told myself that I was helping people establish healthy boundaries and achieve independence from dysfunctional relationships," she wrote. "But the truth is that I was teaching people to abandon love in favor of financial advantage. I was systematically destroying the bonds that make life meaningful, and I was doing it for money." The most revealing part of the letter involved Dr. Webb's own family history. She described growing up in a household where emotional manipulation was the primary form of communication, where family members routinely turned against each other for perceived advantages. Her entry into the family manipulation business hadn't been calculated. It had been an extension of patterns she had learned as a child. "When I saw your physical demonstration at the fitness center, I realized that you possessed something I had never understood, the ability to fight for love rather than against it. You were willing to risk everything to maintain your connection with your son, while I had spent my career teaching people to sever those connections for profit." Dr. Webb's letter concluded with detailed information about other therapists who were still operating using her techniques. She provided names, locations, and specific details about their methods that would prove invaluable to our ongoing research and intervention efforts. Reading her letter in my office at the Family Reconnection Center, surrounded by photos of families we had helped reunite, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of closure that allowed me to understand the full scope of what we had accomplished together. Dr. Webb had been right about one thing in her letter. My physical demonstration at the fitness center had been about more than proving my athletic capabilities. It had been about refusing to accept someone else's definition of my limitations. It had been about demonstrating that strength comes not from youth or professional credentials, but from the willingness to fight for what matters most. That afternoon, I called Marcus to share the news about Dr. Webb's letter. He was now working as the executive director of a nonprofit organization that provided business training to underserved communities, using his MBA to help people who reminded him of our own struggles during his childhood. "Mom, do you think she's genuinely remorseful?" Marcus asked after I read him portions of the letter. "I think she's genuinely broken," I replied. "But remorse isn't the same as redemption. The families she destroyed will carry that damage for generations. The children who were taught to abandon their parents for money will struggle with trust and loyalty for the rest of their lives." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do with the information she provided?" "Use it to protect other families." Dr. Webb's letter contains details about manipulation techniques that we haven't seen before. It will help us develop better prevention strategies and intervention protocols. 6 months later, the information from Dr. Webb's letter led to the exposure of 12 additional therapists who were using family manipulation techniques across 7 states. The investigation that followed resulted in new federal legislation that required family therapists to meet with all affected family members before developing treatment recommendations. The legislation, formerly known as the Family Therapy Transparency Act, included provisions that Dr. Webb herself had suggested in her letter. Therapists were required to disclose any financial relationships with clients or third parties who might benefit from their recommendations. They were prohibited from providing ongoing therapy to family members without including other affected relatives in the treatment process. Most importantly, state licensing boards were given enhanced authority to investigate complaints about family manipulation practices. Today, the Family Reconnection Center has helped reunite over 200 families who were torn apart by therapeutic manipulation. Our research has been cited in professional journals around the world, and our intervention protocols are being used by legitimate therapists who want to help families heal from manipulation rather than profit from their destruction. The Fitness Center where I first demonstrated that age is just a number has become a training ground for a different kind of strength. The emotional and psychological resilience that families need to resist manipulation attempts. I still train individual clients, but I've also developed specialized programs for parents and grandparents who want to maintain strong family connections in a culture that increasingly pathologizes intergenerational bonds. Marcus visits the center regularly, often bringing his own children, my grandchildren, to see their grandmother in action. Watching them cheer as I complete obstacle courses and lift weights that challenge people half my age, I'm reminded that the most important victory wasn't defeating Dr. Webb or exposing her criminal network. The most important victory was proving that love doesn't diminish with age, that strength doesn't fade with years, and that the bonds between family members can survive even the most sophisticated attempts to destroy them. When someone tries to convince you that you're too old, too weak, or too irrelevant to matter, sometimes the best response isn't an argument. It's a demonstration that changes everything. And if you're going to demonstrate, you might as well make it unforgettable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.